On the day we divorced, he married her in a lavish ceremony. I walked away in silence, knowing she was a fraud. The air hung heavy with the scent of gardenias, their cloying sweetness drifting from the church across the cobblestone street where Eleanor stood, half hidden behind a gnarled oak. 50 years she'd carried Charles's name, her life woven into his like ivy choking a trellis, and yet here she was, an outsider at his wedding. The bells chimed, each peal a blade slicing through her chest, as the doors swung open and the crowd spilled out, their laughter bright and careless. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips, her gray eyes fixed on the scene. Charles, stooped but beaming, his arm looped through Margot's, her white gown trailing like a taunt. Eleanor's fingers curled into the bark, grounding her as the world tilted. She'd never had a wedding. No vows, no ring, just a quiet signing at the courthouse, Charles muttering about budgets and practicality. Now, at 72, she watched him give Margot everything he'd denied her. Her shawl slipped, brushing the damp grass at her feet, and she tugged it tighter, the wool scratching her collarbone. The town square buzzed with life, children darted between legs, vendors hawked roasted chestnuts, and the autumn sun cast long shadows over the stone fountain where she and Charles once sat, young and foolish, sharing a single apple. 50 years of excuses echoed in her mind. We'll do it proper when we've got the money, he'd said first, then, why bother? It's just a piece of paper. Later, it became, we're too old for that nonsense. She'd swallowed each one, her love a quiet surrender, believing devotion was enough. But devotion hadn't stopped him from planning this, a lavish ceremony for Margot, the widow who'd moved to town 2 years ago, all sharp smiles and calculated charm. Eleanor's throat tightened as she remembered Margot's hand on Charles's arm at the market, her laughter too loud, her eyes too knowing. The procession moved toward the reception hall, a converted barn draped in fairy lights and ivy. Eleanor followed at a distance, her steps slow, her sensible shoes scuffing the pavement. She shouldn't be here. She should be home, tending the roses or knitting another scarf for Daniel, her son, who was somewhere in that crowd, likely raising a glass to his father's new bride. The thought pierced her, Daniel, her boy, celebrating this betrayal. She paused, her breath catching as she spotted him near the barn's entrance, his tie loosened, his laugh carrying over the murmur of guests. He looked so like Charles at 40, broad-shouldered, with that same crooked grin. Did he know? Had he helped plan this? Eleanor's chest ached, a hollow space where trust used to live. Inside, the hall glowed with warmth, chandeliers casting golden flecks across the polished wood floors. Eleanor lingered by an open window, the curtains fluttering like ghosts against her cheek. She saw Charles at the head table, his hand over Margot's, his eyes crinkling as he whispered something that made her laugh. Margot's hair, dyed a youthful auburn, gleamed under the lights, and her diamond earrings caught the glow. A gift from Charles, Eleanor guessed, her stomach twisting. She'd never owned diamonds. Her only jewelry was a thin silver band, bought secondhand, which she still wore, though it had long since turned her finger green. The music swelled, a waltz, and couples took to the floor. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the cake, tiered and adorned with sugar roses, and she wondered if Charles remembered her baking their anniversary cakes each year, her hands sticky with frosting, her heart hopeful for a kind word. She turned away, the ache in her chest spreading like ink in water. The walk home was a blur, past the bakery with its shuttered windows, the park where geese squawked by the pond, the narrow street lined with sycamores shedding their leaves. Her house, a squat brick cottage, waited in silence, its porch sagging under the weight of time. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and dust, the furniture worn but familiar. She sank into the armchair, her hands folded in her lap, and stared at the framed photo on the mantel, her and Charles, 20 years ago, smiling on a rare vacation to the coast. Her eyes stung, but no tears came. She was too tired for tears, too stunned to scream. The clock ticked, each second a reminder of the life she'd built, now crumbling. The door creaked open hours later, and Charles stepped inside, his suit rumpled, his face flushed with wine. Daniel followed, with Lena, his wife, trailing behind, her heels clicking on the hardwood. They moved as if nothing had changed, as if the day hadn't shattered Eleanor's world. Charles tossed his jacket over a chair, muttering about the band's tempo, while Daniel poured himself a glass of water, joking about the best man's speech. Lena perched on the sofa, scrolling her phone, her lips pursed. Eleanor watched them, her pulse loud in her ears, waiting for someone to speak, to explain, to acknowledge the wound. But they didn't. They laughed, they chatted, they acted as if she hadn't seen Charles pledge his life to another woman. Charles, Eleanor said at last, her voice low but steady, cutting through their chatter. He froze, his glass halfway to his mouth, his eyes narrowing as they met hers. Why didn't you tell me? The question hung there, sharp and raw, and the room stilled. Daniel shifted, his brow furrowing, while Lena glanced up, her phone forgotten. Charles set his glass down, the clink loud in the silence, and leaned back, his expression guarded. Tell you what, he said, his tone light, as if she'd asked about the weather. Eleanor's hands clenched, her nails digging into her palms. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she pulled up the video she'd recorded from the church steps, a shaky clip of Charles and Margot, their vows clear despite the distance. She played it, the sound tinny but unmistakable, and watched their faces change. Charles's jaw tightened, Daniel's eyes widened, and Lena's mouth parted in a silent gasp. It's not what you think, Charles said quickly, his voice rough now, his hand spreading in a gesture of innocence. Margot's sick, Eleanor. Dying. She wanted a wedding before the end. It was her wish, not mine. The words landed like stones, each one heavier than the last. Eleanor stared at him, searching for remorse, for truth, but found only defiance, his eyes daring her to challenge him. She thought of the months leading up to today, Charles's late nights, his excuses about errands, the way Margot's name crept into their conversations. Dying? No. Margot had been vibrant, radiant, her laughter ringing through the square. This was no mercy, no act of pity. This was betrayal, planned and deliberate. 50 years, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. I gave you 50 years, and you gave her this. She gestured at the phone, the video now paused on Margot's smiling face. Charles flinched, but Daniel stepped forward, his expression hard. Mom, you're blowing this out of proportion, he said, his voice sharp, cutting. It was a gesture, not a marriage. You're acting jealous, petty even. Why can't you let Dad do something kind? The word struck like a slap, and Eleanor recoiled, her breath catching. Jealous? Petty? Her own son, siding with his father, dismissing her pain as if it were nothing. She looked at him, at the man she'd raised, and saw a stranger. Lena reached for Daniel's arm, murmuring, maybe we should talk tomorrow, but Eleanor barely heard her. The room felt too small, the air too thick. She stood, her legs unsteady, and walked to the desk in the corner, where a folder waited, its edges worn from months of hesitation. She pulled out the divorce papers, the ink stark against the white, and slid them across the table to Charles. His eyes widened, then narrowed, his mouth twisting into a scowl. You're serious, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. After everything, you'd throw it all away over this? Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight, her heart too heavy. She turned away, her gaze falling on the photo on the mantel, the one of her and Charles, smiling, happy. It mocked her now, a lie captured in a frame. I'm done, she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it carried the weight of 50 years of silence, of sacrifice, of love unreturned. She walked to the door, her hand on the knob, and paused, glancing back at Charles, at Daniel, at the life she'd built and lost in a single day. I'm done. The morning sun sliced through the bedroom curtains, casting slanted beams across Eleanor's suitcase, its leather cracked from years of disuse. She stood before it, her hands hovering over a neatly folded cardigan, her fingers tracing the soft wool as if it held the weight of her past. 50 years in this house, and all she could claim fit into one bag, a handful of clothes, a worn journal, a single photograph of her mother, its edges curled like autumn leaves. The act of packing felt like shedding skin, each item a choice between clinging to the familiar and stepping into the unknown. Her chest tightened, not with sorrow but with a strange, unsteady freedom, as if she were a bird too long caged, unsure if its wings still worked. Downstairs, the kitchen was silent, the kettle cold. Eleanor moved through the space like a ghost, her footsteps muffled on the linoleum. The fridge hummed, its door still plastered with Daniel's childhood drawings, faded now, their crayon lines barely legible. She paused, her gaze lingering on a sketch of a family, stick figures holding hands, her own figure slightly larger, as if Daniel had once seen her as the center of his world. The memory stung, sharp and sudden, and she turned away, her jaw tight. Daniel's words from last night echoed in her mind, petty, jealous, each syllable a barb that hooked deeper the more she dwelled on them. Her son, her only child, had chosen his father's lie over her truth. The front door creaked as she stepped onto the porch, the suitcase dragging behind her, its wheels catching on the uneven wood. The air was crisp, scented with dew and the faint smoke of a neighbor's chimney. Eleanor glanced back at the house, its red brick dulled by time, the rose bushes she'd tended for decades now tangled and wild. She'd planted those roses for Charles, believing beauty could bind them. Foolish, she thought, her lips pressing into a thin line. Love wasn't in the roots she'd nurtured, it was in the choices he'd made, and those choices had never been her. Daniel's car pulled into the driveway, the engines rumbled jarring the morning's quiet. He stepped out, his face shadowed by stubble, his eyes bloodshot from a night of revelry or regret, she couldn't tell which. "Mom," he said, his voice clipped, "where are you going?" The question wasn't concern, it was accusation, as if her leaving were a betrayal of him. Eleanor set the suitcase down, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Away," she said simply, her voice soft but unyielding. She met his gaze, searching for the boy who'd once clung to her skirts, who'd whispered secrets in the dark. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw her as an obstacle, not a mother. Daniel's mouth twitched, his hands shoving into his pockets. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone sharp, almost pleading. "Dad's not perfect, but he's not the villain here. You're throwing away family over, what? Pride?" The word landed like a slap, and Eleanor's breath caught, her fingers curling into fists. Pride? No. This was survival, the reclaiming of a self she'd buried under decades of duty. "I'm not throwing anything away," she said, her voice rising, each word a stone laid on a path she'd never dared walk. "You did that, Daniel. You and your father. You stood there, at that wedding, and you clapped." Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry, refused to let him see her break. Daniel flinched, his gaze dropping to the gravel, but he said nothing, offered nothing. The silence between them was a chasm, and Eleanor turned away, dragging her suitcase toward the street, her heart pounding with the weight of her choice. The bus station was a mile away, its benches chipped and graffitied, the air thick with diesel and dust. Eleanor sat, her suitcase at her feet, and pulled out her journal, its pages yellowed but mostly blank. She'd bought it years ago, intending to write poetry, to capture the dreams she'd once had, of painting in Paris, of dancing under foreign stars. But life had intervened, Charles's needs, Daniel's upbringing, the endless rhythm of meals and laundry. Now, her pen scratched across the page, hesitant at first, then bolder, "I am not his wife anymore. I am not their anchor. I am Eleanor, and I am enough." The words felt like a vow, fragile but fierce, and she closed the journal, her hands trembling with possibility. She boarded a bus to the coast, the ticket a whim purchased with savings she'd hidden from Charles. The sea had always called her, its vastness a promise of something larger than the life she'd known. As the bus rumbled through rolling hills, Eleanor's mind wandered to her youth, to the summer she'd met Charles at a county fair. He'd been charming then, his laugh easy, his promises bright. But even then, she saw it now, there'd been a hollowness to his affection, a convenience in choosing her, a quiet girl who wouldn't demand too much. She'd mistaken his steadiness for love, her own longing for connection blinding her to his indifference. The realization didn't hurt, it clarified, like sunlight burning through fog. At the coastal town, Eleanor rented a small room above a bakery, the scent of bread rising each morning like a gentle wake-up call. She walked the cliffs daily, the wind tangling her hair, the waves below a symphony of chaos and calm. She began posting photos online, not for validation, but to mark her existence, a seashell cradled in her palm, a sunset bleeding red across the horizon, her own shadow stretching long against the sand. Each post was a whisper to herself, I am here. I am alive. Her followers were few, mostly strangers, but their comments, kind, curious, felt like lifelines, proof that she wasn't invisible. Margot's message came a week later, a private note dripping with false warmth. Eleanor, let's talk, it read. No need for bad blood. I want us to be friends. Eleanor stared at the screen, her coffee cooling in her hand, and laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled the gulls outside her window. Friends? Margot, with her calculated tears and her diamond earrings, wanted peace? No. This was control, a way to keep Eleanor small, compliant. She deleted the message, her finger steady, her resolve ironclad. But the encounter lingered, a reminder of the life she'd left, and she began to piece together the truth. Charles's late nights, the whispers at church, the way Margot's perfume had clung to his coat. The wedding hadn't been a whim, it had been months in the making, a secret kept while Eleanor dusted their home and cooked their meals. The confrontation came unexpectedly, in a cafe overlooking the harbor. Eleanor sat with her journal, sketching the boats bobbing in the distance, when Margot appeared, her auburn hair catching the light, her smile practiced. Eleanor, she said, sliding into the opposite chair uninvited, you look well. The words were honeyed, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. Eleanor set her pen down, her heart racing but her face calm. What do you want, Margot? She asked, her voice low, each word deliberate. Margot leaned forward, her bracelet clinking against the table, and launched into a performance, tears welling, her voice trembling as she spoke of Charles's kindness, of her illness, of wanting to heal the rift. The cafe's other patrons glanced over, their murmurs sympathetic, their gazes painting Eleanor as the villain. She saw it then, Margot's game, her need to be the saint, the victim, the beloved. Eleanor's chest burned, not with anger but with clarity. You're not dying, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through Margot's monologue. And you're not my friend. You took what wasn't yours, and you did it with a smile. The words were a release, a shedding of the silence she'd carried for decades. Margot's face faltered, her tears drying as the crowd's whispers turned uncertain. Eleanor stood, leaving her coffee untouched, and walked out, the sea air cool against her skin. She didn't look back, didn't need to. The cafe, Margot, the town, they were her past, and she was done apologizing for wanting more. Alone on the cliff that evening, Eleanor watched the stars emerge, each one a pinprick of light in the vast dark. She thought of Daniel, of Charles, of the life she'd built and lost. But the ache was softer now, less a wound and more a scar. She opened her journal and wrote, I am not theirs anymore. I am mine. The words felt like a beginning, a map to a life she was only just starting to imagine. The sea roared below the cliff, its waves clawing at the rocks as Eleanor sat cross-legged on a weathered blanket, her phone balanced on her knee. The screen glowed with venom, comments on Daniel's post, each one a dart aimed at her heart. Bitter old hag, one read. Jealous of a dying woman's happiness, another sneered. She scrolled, her thumb trembling, unable to look away from the digital mob that had crowned her the villain. Daniel's words, posted for the world to see, were the sharpest cut. My mother's selfishness has torn our family apart. Margot deserves better. Her son, her flesh and blood, had painted her as a monster, and the strangers of the internet had eagerly joined the hunt. Eleanor's chest constricted, not from the faceless cruelty but from the betrayal of the boy she'd rocked through fevers, whose tears she'd wiped, whose dreams she'd cradled. She set the phone down, her gaze lifting to the horizon, where the sky bled orange into the sea, and whispered to herself, I am not what they say. Her room above the bakery had become a sanctuary, its walls papered with faded florals, its single window framing the endless churn of the ocean. She moved through it now, her steps deliberate, lighting a candle that smelled of sage and salt. The flicker of the flame steadied her, a small defiance against the chaos of the world beyond. She opened her journal, its pages now thick with thoughts, and wrote, "They can hate me, but they cannot erase me." The act of writing was a tether, grounding her as the online storm raged. She'd never sought fame or pity, only a space to exist, yet her quiet posts, photos of driftwood, of her shadow against the tide, had somehow become fodder for judgment. The irony twisted in her gut. She'd spent decades invisible, and now, in her rebellion, she was seen, but only as a caricature. The coastal town, with its salt-streaked cottages and bustling pier, had begun to feel like home, but the internet's reach was relentless. At the market, where she bought apples and fresh bread, whispers followed her, glances from strangers who'd seen Daniel's post, their lips pursed in disapproval. Eleanor held her head high, her basket swinging at her side, but each stare chipped at her resolve. She thought of her mother, long gone, whose voice still echoed in her mind. "Never let them see you bend, Ellie." She clung to that now, her spine straight, her smile polite but distant. But alone, in the quiet of her room, she allowed herself to feel the weight, her fingers tracing the silver band she still wore, its green stain a reminder of a life she'd outgrown. Relief came unexpectedly, in the form of strangers who refused to let her drown. At a small knitting circle she'd joined on a whim, held in a community center that smelled of pine and coffee, Eleanor found allies. There was Ruth, a retired nurse with a laugh like a foghorn, who'd lost her husband to war and her patients to fools. And Clara, barely 60, whose sharp wit hit a heart bruised by a daughter who'd stopped calling. They'd seen Eleanor's posts, not the venom but the quiet beauty in her photos, and when Daniel's betrayal went viral, they closed ranks around her like sentinels. "Let the boy stew in his own mess," Ruth said one evening, her needles clicking as she worked a scarf. "You don't owe him your silence." Clara was fiercer, her fingers flying over her phone as she typed replies to the cruelest comments. "This one says you're a homewrecker," she snorted, reading aloud. "As if you're the one who threw a wedding behind your husband's back." Eleanor managed a smile, her first in days, and felt the knot in her chest loosen. These women, with their own scars and stories, saw her, not the villain, not the wife, but Eleanor, raw and real. They met weekly, their gatherings spilling beyond knitting into wine-soaked dinners, walks along the pier, plans for a group trip to Italy. For the first time in decades, Eleanor laughed until her sides ached, her voice mingling with theirs, her joy a rebellion against the world's verdict. But the pain of Daniel's betrayal lingered, a bruise that throbbed with every quiet moment. She dreamed of him sometimes, not the man who'd condemned her but the child who'd clung to her hand at the fair, his eyes wide with wonder. She woke from those dreams with a hollow ache, her fingers reaching for the journal to spill her grief. "I raised him, loved him, and he chose a lie over me." Yet she refused to beg for his love, refused to shrink back into the role of the forgiving mother. She'd spent too long bending, now, she would stand. One afternoon, as she sat sketching the lighthouse that crowned the cliff, her phone buzzed with a new notification, a message from Lena, Daniel's wife, whose silence had been its own kind of wound. "Eleanor, can we talk?" it read, simple but heavy. Eleanor hesitated, her pencil still, her mind racing. Lena had been at the wedding, clapping alongside Daniel, her loyalty seemingly tied to her husband. But there'd been moments, Lena's quick glances, her hand on Daniel's arm as if to restrain him, that hinted at unease. Eleanor typed a reply, her words careful, "Meet me at the cafe by the pier. Tomorrow, noon." The cafe was crowded, its tables spilling onto the boardwalk, the air thick with salt and the sizzle of fried fish. Eleanor arrived early, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes scanning the crowd. Lena appeared, her hair pulled back, her face pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept in days. She sat, her hands twisting in her lap, and for a moment, neither spoke, the hum of the cafe filling the silence. "I'm sorry," Lena said at last, her voice low, almost lost in the chatter. "I didn't know how to stop it, Daniel, the post, all of it." Her eyes met Eleanor's, bright with unshed tears, and Eleanor saw something new, shame, yes, but also fear, as if Lena were trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. He's so angry, Eleanor. At himself, mostly, but he's taking it out on you. Eleanor sipped her tea, the warmth grounding her as she studied Lena. Why are you here? She asked, her tone even but laced with curiosity. Lena's hands stilled, her shoulders slumping. Because I see you, she said, her voice breaking. I see what you've done, what you've given up. And I'm scared I'll end up like you, stuck, silent, erased. The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded, and Eleanor felt a pang of recognition. Lena wasn't just apologizing, she was pleading, for understanding, for a way out of her own cage. You're not me, Eleanor said, her voice soft but firm. But you have to choose yourself, Lena. No one else will. She reached across the table, her hand brushing Lena's, a fleeting gesture of solidarity. Lena nodded, her lips trembling, and for a moment, they were not mother-in-law and daughter-in-law but two women, bound by the weight of unspoken truths. Eleanor left the cafe lighter, not because Lena's words had healed the wound but because they'd reminded her of her own strength. She walked the pier, the boards creaking under her feet, and stopped to watch a group of children chase seagulls, their laughter sharp and free. She thought of Ruth and Clara, of the trip to Italy they'd planned, of the life she was building, piece by piece. The internet could rage, Daniel could hate her, but she was no longer defined by their judgments. She pulled out her phone and posted a photo of the pier, the sun glinting off the water, with a single caption, I am still here. That night, in her room, she danced alone to a scratchy jazz record, her bare feet sliding across the floor, her arms swaying as if embracing the air. She laughed, breathless, and caught her reflection in the window, a woman with gray hair and fierce eyes, no longer a shadow. She was Eleanor, and she was enough. The wind howled along the coastal cliffs, tugging at Eleanor's scarf as she stood at the edge, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Below, the sea churned, its foam-flecked waves a mirror to the turmoil she'd left behind. Her phone, tucked in her pocket, had been silent for days. No more messages from Lena, no further venom from Daniel's online crusade. She welcomed the quiet, let it settle into her bones like the salt in the air. Her journal lay open on a nearby rock, its pages fluttering, filled with sketches of the lighthouse and fragments of poetry she'd begun to write. The tide does not apologize for its pull, nor will I. Each word was a brick in the wall she was building around her heart, not to shut out the world but to protect the woman she was becoming. She inhaled deeply, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and felt a flicker of peace, fragile but real. Back in her room, the scent of baking bread drifted up from the shop below, mingling with the lavender she'd tucked into a vase. Eleanor sat at the small desk, sorting through postcards she'd bought for Ruth and Clara, her fingers lingering on one depicting a Tuscan vineyard. Their planned trip to Italy was months away, but the thought of it, cobblestone streets, warm wine, laughter under foreign stars, ignited a spark in her chest. She'd never traveled beyond the coast, never dared to dream so large. Now, the world felt possible, not as a reward but as a right. She wrote a note on the postcard, her pen steady, to Ruth, who taught me to roar. As she sealed it, a knock at the door startled her, sharp and insistent. Daniel stood in the hallway, his coat rumpled, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion. The sight of him, her son, yet a stranger, sent a jolt through Eleanor, her hand tightening on the doorknob. What do you want? She asked, her voice low, edged with a wariness she hadn't felt before. He shifted, his gaze darting to the floor, then back to her, as if searching for the mother who'd once yielded to his every need. I need you to come home, he said, his words rushed, almost desperate. Everything's falling apart. Dad's a mess, Margot's useless, and I can't fix it. His voice cracked, and Eleanor saw the boy he'd been, the one who'd begged her to mend his broken toys. But she wasn't that mother anymore, and the realization steadied her, even as her heart ached. Fix it yourself, she said, her tone calm but unyielding. She stepped back, her hand still on the door, ready to close it. Daniel's face twisted, a mix of shock and anger, as if her refusal were a betrayal he hadn't anticipated. You're really going to abandon us? He snapped, his voice rising. After everything Dad did for you? You're acting like you're the victim, but you're the one who walked away. The accusation hung between them, heavy with years of unspoken resentment. Eleanor's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She saw him clearly now, not just her son, but a man shaped by his father's excuses, blind to the sacrifices she'd made. I didn't walk away, she said, her voice a quiet blade. I chose myself. You should try it sometime. She closed the door, the click loud in the silence, and leaned against it, her breath uneven. The weight of his words lingered, but they didn't break her. She moved to the window, gazing at the sea, and let the rhythm of the waves drown out the echo of his anger. News of Charles's stroke reached her a week later, not through Daniel but via a hesitant text from Lena. Charles is in the hospital. It's bad. I thought you should know. Eleanor read it on the pier, the boards creaking under her weight, the gulls screeching overhead. Her first instinct was to run, to the hospital, to the past, to the role of caregiver she'd played for decades. But she paused, her fingers curling around the phone, and let the impulse pass. Charles wasn't her burden anymore. Still, curiosity, or perhaps a ghost of duty, drove her to the hospital, a sterile maze of white walls and antiseptic air, where the past waited like a trap. In the ICU, Charles lay tethered to machines, his face slack, his hands still. Eleanor stood at the foot of his bed, her scarf clutched in her hands, her mind a tangle of memories, his laughter at the fair, his coldness at the courthouse, his vows to Margot under the gardenia-scented sky. She searched for love in those memories, for a reason to mourn, but found only exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness from carrying his weight for 50 years. Daniel sat beside him, his head bowed, his shoulders hunched. Lena hovered near the door, her eyes red, her fingers twisting a tissue. He was arguing with Margot, Lena whispered when Daniel stepped out for coffee. She burned dinner again, left the house a mess. He just collapsed. Her voice trembled, not with grief but with guilt, as if she'd failed to hold their fragile world together. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on Charles, and saw the truth in his stillness. Margot's charm had faded, her incompetence exposed, and Charles had paid the price. Daniel returned, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. You came, he said, his tone a mix of relief and accusation. Does this mean you'll help? He needs you, Mom. The plea was raw, but Eleanor heard the manipulation beneath it, the expectation that she'd slip back into her old role. No, she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. He doesn't need me. He never did. The words were a release, a severing of the final thread that bound her to Charles. Daniel's face crumpled, his hands clenching into fists. You're heartless, he spat, his voice low, venomous. Margot's a mess, I've lost my job because of this scandal, and you're just standing there, like it's nothing. Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching, and saw the fear behind his anger, fear of a world where he couldn't control the narrative, where his mistakes had consequences. It's not nothing, she said, her voice soft but firm. It's everything. But it's not mine to fix. She turned to Lena, who watched in silence, her eyes wide with something like awe. You know where to find me, Eleanor said, a quiet invitation, then walked away, her steps echoing in the sterile corridor. Outside, the air was sharp, the sky bruised with clouds. Eleanor walked to the cliff, her scarf trailing like a banner, and stood where the earth met the sea. She thought of Charles, of the life they'd built and broken, and felt no hatred, only a quiet resolve. Daniel's regret, Margot's failure, the chaos they'd sown, they were not her burden. She pulled out her journal and wrote, I am not their savior. I am my own. The words anchored her, a lighthouse in the storm. That evening, she joined Ruth and Clara for dinner at a seaside tavern, the table strewn with oyster shells and wineglasses. They laughed, their voices rising over the hum of the crowd, and planned their Italian adventure, Florence's domes, Rome's ruins, the taste of gelato under a summer sun. Eleanor leaned back, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass, and felt the weight of her past lift, not gone but lighter, a shadow she could carry without breaking. She was no longer a wife, a mother defined by others' needs. She was Eleanor, and she was free.